Welcome to HP at Church, a podcast about Harry Potter and the Bible. I'm Pastor Kay, and I use pronouns like she and her.
And I'm Pastor Emily, and my pronouns are they, them, theirs.
In this episode, we'll discuss the 3rd through 5th Sundays after Epiphany. If you want to follow along on our blog, it's hpatchurch.wordpress.com. And you can find links to the Bible passages we'll be using and more information on other references we make in this episode.
Also, if you appreciate what we do, consider supporting us on Patreon at patreon.com/hpatchurch. Not only do you get access to special content, but you'll also be able to help us be more accessible and sustainable as a podcast, which is important to us, since not everybody has a quick quotes quill to help them.
Our first Sunday for this episode is the 3rd Sunday after Epiphany, which this year will fall on January 26th. Our first reading for this Sunday is from Isaiah chapter 9, verses 1 through 4. Despite recent struggles, God promises the northern tribes of Zebulun and Naphtali an upcoming time of glory and joy.
So one of the themes that I noticed in this passage is the theme of liberation. So part of God's promises to Zebulun and Naphtali are promises of liberation from what is oppressing them. And I was reminded of Hagrid's liberation from Azkaban in Chamber of Secrets, because particularly for him, like, the incarceration, the oppression that he has is unjust. He
Right.
shouldn't be in Azkaban, and so that liberation is a particular type of, like, liberation for one who should not be in prison.
Right.
Also within the scope of abolition, where, I don't think that jails are the best thing for anybody, but...
Yeah.
In verse 1, though, I was struck by the statement that there will be no gloom. So, as we all know, I am from Colorado. In the mountains of Colorado where I grew up, there are like 5 days out of the entire year that it is not either sunny or precipitating, where it's just like overcast gloom. And both Kay and I currently live in the Midwest. And I don't know if this is your experience of the Midwest, Kay, but my experience of the Midwest is that there are about 5 days of sun, and okay, that's an exaggeration, but there are like 50
This
days.
is the season of gloom and doom and anguish in the Midwest, because from like January through the middle of April or so, it just feels ugly and
it's just like
and,
overcast, and there's not snow on the ground, although we are currently in a winter storm warning right now. So thinking about the Midwest winter today is like an exception, because there's snow on the ground, which actually increases the amount of sunlight that we receive because it reflects off of the snow.
Right.
So I'm much more delighted than I was 2 days ago. But then I was thinking about in the UK and in Scotland in particular, like the grey of the UK without sun, and how gloomy. Like, I think the actual weather at Hogwarts was probably worse than we are given to believe, because I think the unreliable narrator / Harry Potter only noticed things when it fit or was completely at odds with the mood, and so like a dull, gloomy gray. I don't know if that was ever commented on at all.
Well, when you think about it, when there is a sunshiny day, Harry definitely comments on it. Like, that is something everyone notices. I have a friend who's from Scotland, and I think she'd agree with that it's regularly, like, the normal state of affairs is overcast and a little gloomy. So the fact that Harry actually notices and points out when it's a sunny day, I think that tells us something. Kind of like how we read the Bible and anything that is pointed out as unusual or different, well, that tells us that the usual state of affairs is the opposite. So people make a lot of conclusions about what life was like in the Bible through that method.
Yep.
So I was looking up verse 1, and I read this bit about gloom and anguish, and I thought to myself, oh, look, Dementors. And the thing is, I know the effect that Dementors have on other people around them, but I wonder what life is like for the Dementors. Like, they they eat happiness, right? But
Mm-hmm.
does that mean that they feel happiness? Or are they also, like, because they eat the happiness, that destroys the happiness, so they're also constantly in doom and gloom and anguish? And I wonder if there's a way to cure them of this effect that they have on humans. Like, it's not technically their fault. Like, they're not... this is just what they eat. They don't really have... Like, I don't have control over what I can eat and get nourishment out of. Like, I can control my diet to a certain extent, but I still have to eat something.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't choose what I can get nourishment out of, when I was born or something like that. There's certain things that give me nourishment.
And it's in our evolution of, like, how our teeth are shaped and...
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't understand the magical theory behind why they can only eat certain kinds of emotions and not others. But, like, if they eat happiness, wouldn't it make more sense for them to inspire the emotions that they do eat in people? Like, wouldn't it make more sense for them to be creatures that inspire happiness in others so that they can eat it? Or is this just like are they a failed branch of evolution? And did Ms. Rowling think this through this far or not?
The answer to if she thought it through this far or not is definitely no.
Right, probably. But I also wonder things like, do they have this effect on house elves and merpeople?
Yeah.
Like, are the house elves of Hogwarts affected by them when they're there to guard the place? Or the merpeople in the lake? The merpeople in the lake would be at more of their mercy because they're outside, which is where the Dementors were patrolling.
Mm-hmm.
And even if we could cure them, are Dementors sentient enough to consent to being experimented on in the first place? Like, do we know if they have thought processes, or
I think
they...
they do because, well, thought processes, right? Because Dumbledore talks about them being restless.
Right, but animals can be restless. So are they creatures, or are they... Like, we don't know. That particular thought came to me because I watched Stargate Atlantis, which was a TV show from many, many years ago now. And there was a whole side plot about taking these aliens called the Wraith, which basically fed on the life force of other people and creatures, and trying to do medical experiments on them so that they wouldn't do that anymore and they'd stop killing people. And it was a whole medical ethics nightmare because they never actually tried to get consent in the first place, and it got really ugly after that. So yeah, there are a lot of questions about Dementors we don't seem to have asked yet, or at least I haven't seen those conversations.
Yeah, it is interesting though. They feed on joy, but I think they feed on joy as a non-renewable resource, right? Because the Patronus is the embodiment of joy.
Right.
But in a way that is renewable.
And also, it's just so strong that it scares the crap out of them.
Yeah, but
kind of like how, if I was... I like donuts, but if I had a gigantic donut monster that was, coming up on me, I would probably be a little nervous. So...
Yeah, but I think it's more than that, because it's a sense that they... it repels them. But I think part of what, because they also can consume someone's soul, and so I think it's the piece that the soul is connected, at least in the Harry Potter world, to a sense of joy, and so but also a precarious sense of joy, that it's not a solid, never-ending thing, and so then when they get rebuffed and can only sense joy and no other emotions, I think. Yeah, so I think evolutionarily, it's not as surprising that they wouldn't inspire joy. And I think about them that way. But we could have a whole side episode on Dementors and the inner workings of Dementors and depression and all of
and
those
how
things.
would the world be different if they were trying to farm joy in people instead of
instead of steal it.
Yeah. And then reading verse 4, talking about all these burdens and yokes, that makes me think of moving, from one place to another, or moving from one house to another, because that's probably how someone would have moved back then, because they didn't have U-Haul and so on. And so part of what these people are celebrating is that they will get to keep their homes and they don't have to move. And that makes me think about the trio after the war is over, realizing that they finally either get to go home, which would be Ron and Hermione after some work, although probably a different home, than she used to have, or finally have a home in the first place, like Harry.
Mm.
I still love the idea of Harry finally getting to go apartment shopping.
Yeah. Well, and I took it a totally different direction. We both went for the same verses this time, but different ways.
That's going to happen a couple times this episode, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But for the yoke of their burden and the bar across their shoulders, the rod of their oppressor, those all felt like the spells and the magic that keeps house elves bound to their household or their family or whatever, and enslaved. Or it felt, I mean, Imperial also has the side thing of making you feel good, but minus that side thing of making you feel good, it felt like Imperial, where it's like placed upon you and restricts your ability to function on your own and decide for yourself what you want to do.
Yeah.
Our second reading for this Sunday comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 10 through 18. Paul encourages the followers of Christ in Corinth to stop fighting between themselves and focus on what they have in common, a share in Christ's death and resurrection. So, a theme that came up for me in this passage was a theme of belonging. So, thinking about, right, Paul is calling the followers of Christ to think about how they belong to each other and to Christ. And that comes up a lot in the Harry Potter universe, particularly for Harry and his own trying to figure out how he belongs and if he belongs and what sort of belonging beyond the token unknown hero of everyone kind of identity. But then I was also thinking about the diversity of creatures and beings and people in the magical world and how they have a sense of belonging.
Yeah.
And what their sense of belonging is. And right, we get in the Fountain of Magical Brethren.
Your very favorite statue.
There's a sense of belonging that is very discriminate and very hierarchical. And so how do people ever know that they belong, and do they ever truly belong if they are not the pinnacle of the Fountain of Magical Brethren?
Yeah. On a lighter note, verse 11 is one of those verses that it's like there's a whole storyline behind that one verse that we will never hear. I realize, in a practical sense, that probably what this verse is implying is that Paul has a pen pal in Chloe's family, which isn't all that extraordinary. But I like to imagine that Chloe has this whole secret network of spies in congregations around Greece, reporting to Paul. And Paul, in this verse, has just thoughtlessly let the cat out of the bag, and Chloe now has to go on the run with her collections of wigs and fake noses and so on. Probably this isn't true, but, this is one of those verses that implies a whole story behind the verse. And that means that if I'm not going to hear the actual story, I get to come up with various options, right? That's how that works.
I mean, that's how Midrash works.
Yes. So that's one option. But if you want to take it a slightly darker turn and, probably also lose the wigs and fake noses, which I have to say is my favorite part of this story, we can also imagine that her people might have been more like Umbridge's inquisitorial squad. And not just spying, but also making accusations and trying to be holier than thou and so on, which would have been a much uglier thing. And I would hope that Paul would call out in this letter, but he doesn't. So you never know.
He's Paul, so
yeah, it really can go either way. Or he might honestly not know. I mean, he
also
travels
true.
a lot, so he doesn't get to be there very often. So there's probably a lot of stuff going on he doesn't know about, even with his secret network of spies run by Chloe.
That is now going to be my headcanon for this.
Awesome.
For the church in Corinth. Yep. So I was struck by the next verse, verse 12, where Paul is talking about how people are saying, well, I belong to Paul, I belong to Apollos, I belong to Cephas, I belong to Christ, and how easy of a comparison it is to go to the Harry Potter world and say, to the magical world and say, well, I belong to Hufflepuff, I belong to Gryffindor, I belong to Ravenclaw, I belong to Slytherin. Or you could
And
even do
in
it.
fact, we do. I mean, we had a whole argument about this last episode, so I don't think we get to ignore that.
No, but I think there's a way in which that becomes the all-important thing, which eliminates the bigger senses of belonging and the bigger
In that we are all
allegiances.
fans of Harry Potter.
In that we are all fans of Harry Potter. Because you could even go it up one right to Hogwarts. We all belong to Hogwarts, but then all of the schools could do the same thing. But like, we all belong to this magical world and this universe that has been created. Sure. And that we have continued to help co-create. Yeah. Because it doesn't just belong to the one first creator. Hashtag the author is dead.
Although, you know, as Christians, we wouldn't say that she was the first creator anyway, because she was also created.
True.
We reach verse 16, and I read this verse and I say to myself, just, wow, imagine being Stephanus. Just being the afterthought for the next couple thousand years. You know, as we read the Bible, he is an afterthought forever. It's kind of like how I tend to mourn at Thomas getting the nickname Doubting Thomas and being stuck with that forever.
Right.
Because it shows up once in the Bible, and that's really not at all like the whole of who he is.
And also, that's not even the like right word.
Yeah, no. Translation, yay. But like poor Stephanus getting stuck being an afterthought forever.
I mean,
and
but
I'm
also
sure that
he made it in the books.
Yeah, I mean, if he was a woman, we probably wouldn't have heard his name, unless he had a whole network of spies throughout Greece.
Exactly. Go Chloe.
But when I wonder who in the Harry Potter books would have felt like Stephanus and who would have known what that felt like, I have to go with Ron, because it's pretty clear, especially in the early books, that this is how Ron thought of himself as an afterthought, and thought that his family saw him, because it's pretty clear that Arthur and Molly were trying to have a girl, and they just kept going until they did. So Ron got stuck in the worst position for that.
Yeah, it's true. Poor Ron. In verse 18, we hear about the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. I'm thinking about the ways that the resistance to Voldemort is foolishness to those who are invading Hogwarts, and maybe even to some of the people who have been resisting at the end of the Battle of Hogwarts, when Harry has supposedly died. But thinking about the ways that Voldemort comes back and is like, oh, there's no point even in resisting me because look, Harry is dead. Ha ha ha. And yet, there is a point in resistance, and there is wisdom in it.
Yeah. I mean, even if Harry was actually dead and stayed that way.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is Matthew chapter 4, verses 12 through 23. John the Baptist is arrested, and Jesus retreats to the lands of Zebulun and Naphtali for a time, before emerging with a message of repentance. As he begins his public ministry, he recruits his first disciples to fish for people. So, one of the things that comes up as Jesus is beginning to collect his disciples is joining people in something new without much info. Right? Like, Jesus is just like, hey, come follow me. I will make you fish for people. And we'll get into the, like, corny puns later. But yeah, they just, like, drop what they're doing. And you're like, all right, let's go. Yeah. Christianity is always in favor of corny puns. My Christianity is. Yes. But it reminded me of how Harry first gets onto the Gryffindor Quidditch team, right? He thinks he's in trouble. He just caught the Remember All from Draco. McGonagall comes out and is like yelling at him, and then she's like, Professor Flitwick. Is that Flitwick? I think it is, yeah. And then she's like, I need to borrow wood. And of course, Harry's like, what is wood? Like, is this some sort of like corporal punishment? Scary stuff. And then she's like, you're on the new Gryffindor Quidditch team. It's like, okay, but like there's no other option for him. It's just like, all right, sure. In verse 13, we hear about Jesus going north And this verse calls to mind, for me, Harry wandering the streets of Surrey and his Muggle neighborhood at the start of the 5th book. These are his people, but not really. He should feel at home here, but he doesn't. And he's in danger. Jesus is among his own people in the north. Despite not being in Israel, he had no trouble finding 4 disciples right away, for example. But this isn't his home, and he's here because John was arrested, so he's probably in some danger too. That's why he stepped away for a little bit. And so he and Harry seem to have much the same mindset at that moment.
Yeah. In verse 18, we hear about Jesus walking by the Sea of Galilee and the brothers casting a net into the sea. And I could not, the only thing I could think of was Dubby.
Oh.
Dying by the sea and being buried there at Shell Cottage.
Yeah.
And now that I'm crying, in the next verse, in verse 19, Jesus says to the fishermen, "Follow me and I will make you fish for people." Huh? I added that, but I really think that's how Jesus did it. And I think there has to be a fanfic somewhere with Arthur and Sirius just going back and forth telling these super nerdy jokes, corny jokes.
Not just them.
Not just them.
And Remus in the background, clutching at his hair, and this is why all of his hair has fallen out by the 4th book.
Yeah, I think Remus would just roll his eyes for a lot of it, and all of the teenagers would groan.
Yeah, except for the twins,
who would be totally on it.
Yeah.
Yep.
Verse 23, we see that Jesus immediately, as soon as his ministry starts, he immediately went out and started curing the sick. That is his first thing on his agenda, aside from preaching repentance.
Every single one.
Lots. And I wonder, how would the Harry Potter books be different if Harry had gone on a trajectory that led him to decide to be a healer instead of an Auror? How would Harry be different as a person? He had a lot of experience with magical healing, and let's not forget the exciting bit of Gilderoy Lockhart removing all the bones in his arm. But, a lot of those experiences were good experiences, and Madame Pomfrey seems to be extremely competent. You'd have to be in that job. And so it's not that far of a reach to see him wanting to be a healer. And also, when we're talking about young hero fictional stories written by people, at the end wanting to be a doctor is not an entirely out of reach concept. That's a pretty normal trajectory for them to go on. So I wonder about how the books would be different if he decided to be a healer, and what little notes would we have noticed along the way that would have changed.
Yeah, that would be interesting. I always think about Harry as a teacher because I think he's actually really well inclined towards that and good at it, and would be good once he actually learned theory and stuff. But I never thought about him as a healer. I like it. Be at least as good as he was as an Auror, because that was just because somebody planted the seed at the right time.
Yeah.
Our next Sunday for this episode is the 4th Sunday after Epiphany, which falls on February 2nd this year. And our first reading is Micah chapter 6, verses 1 through 8. God gossips with creation about God's relationship with Israel, concluding that all God wants is for them to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God.
I'm glad you liked that. I wasn't entirely sure how to phrase that, but really gossips is the closest to what God is doing there that I could come up with.
Which is funny because that's not how I read it at all, but I like the...
Well, the beginning part is, God is definitely venting, So.
Well, I will get to that.
Yeah, okay.
After the theme, because I keyed in on the beginning part in a different way. But one of the themes here in Micah is the emptiness of actions and responses. So part of God's frustration and the part of why God wants people to do justice, love kindness, and walk humbly with God is because they've been fasting, but not in a meaningful way. Their fast has been empty of commitment and empty of justice and right relationship with other people. And so it reminded me of when in Goblet of Fire, Harry and Draco tried to cast spells at each other before potions class, and Harry's spell hits Crab, I think, and Draco's spell hits Hermione, and her teeth start to grow out really long, and Snape comes out and he's like, "What are you all doing?" And everybody's like, "They did this and they did that," and all that stuff, and he, of course, like, listens to the Slytherins and is, like, sends Crab to Madame Pomfrey. And then when Ron says, "Draco got Hermione's teeth," Snape's like, "I don't see any difference." And he's just, like, he has, as a teacher, like, he's responding to an incident, but there's such emptiness in his response.
Yeah.
So, failed pedagogy at Hogwarts. And then in the beginning of the passage in verses 1 and 2, so I know you had talked about, like, God gossiping with creation. I heard it as, like, an invitation to, like, state your case and, like, have accountability to
Oh, see, that's
creation.
much more positive and optimistic. I like that. Okay.
Right. Well, and it's not necessarily all that positive, because, like, if we as humans right now were to give an accounting to creation, we'd have a lot to answer for. And we do have a lot to answer for. There is not a good defense for how we have treated creation and how we have treated other people and God.
Put it to you this way, I consider offering the chance of having a trial at all to be a positive.
True.
Because, like, this is God, so that doesn't actually need to happen.
God actually knows everything already.
Yeah.
And, yeah. Well, and then that reminded me of in Lord of the Rings, when I think it's Fangorn Forest, but the forest has been so desecrated and destroyed for the purpose of more, like, orcs and Uruk-hai, that when they flee to the forest, they're all destroyed. Like, the forest gets back at them. Or, like, when the Ents discover the destruction of the forest and they're like, "Oh no!" And then they finally join the fight and capture Saruman in the tower, or in Harry Potter when the centaurs finally join the fight, because they finally are like, "Okay, nope, this is a big enough deal. The harm that is to come, we don't have to be totally separated, but we, as part of this space and this magical world, are going to respond to this injustice and this harm."
Yeah. So sometimes when I read the Bible, I am responding to, like, the actual words and stories and so forth in the Bible. But sometimes when I read the Bible, I am irretrievably reminded of practical experiences I've had because of the Bible. And this is the second kind of comment, for the record. When we reach verse 5, I acknowledge, of course, that the names of places and people in the Bible are real names and therefore do have actual correct pronunciations. And that's fine. But in the practical life of a pastor, getting people to be willing to read the Bible out loud, both in worship and also outside of worship for, like, Bible studies and things, is an important part of the job, and getting them comfortable with doing that, because that helps them be more familiar with the Bible and encourages them to, spend actual time reading the Bible. And doing that is difficult enough without also being the pronunciation police. So I generally don't do the pronunciation police thing. And instead, for reading the Bible out loud, my two rules that I share with congregation members are, 1, sound confident in whatever you say, and
Always.
People will go with it. And 2, avoid pronouncing anything so that it sounds like it's a modern-day swear word. Also, presumably, like, not modern-day swear words that other people would actually know, but there aren't that many of them. So the first city that is listed in this verse, as far as I am concerned, when it comes to reading the Bible out loud for worship and other purposes, the first city is pronounced she-team, and not anything else that it might look like. Now, for those of us muggles who are reading the Harry Potter books and who cannot cast actual real-life spells because we are not magical, no matter how much we want to imagine otherwise, Emily.
Speak for yourself.
And who might also, some of us might be trying to get people into reading who weren't into reading before and therefore might be using the Harry Potter books for that. The same rules can work with the Harry Potter books because there are a lot of really unusual words in there. But since we don't have to worry about getting the spell wrong, right, Hermione, we can encourage them to pronounce things as seems best at the time, as long as they sound confident and preferably don't, like, wander into swearing.
Yeah, pronounce those things.
Yes, just say them out loud. That's the important part. And it'll be fine. And the important thing is that you're enjoying the story.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's funny because part of why Hermione and Krum have a conversation at the Yule Ball about how to pronounce Hermione's name is because nobody knew how to pronounce her name.
Yes!
And so J.K. Rowling had to figure out how to tell people how to pronounce her name. It was hilarious.
Yeah, I love that.
Mm-hmm.
As someone who, before I got married, I had well, I never thought it was a difficult to pronounce last name, but my goodness, people had trouble with it.
Mm-hmm. Well, so I went in a different direction for verse 5 and was thinking about, like, this actually, verse 5 sounded a lot like God's defense of God's own actions and God's own self, right? Like, remember, yeah. I did this, and I did this, and I did this, and what thanks do I get? Ever. None. No thanks from you ungrateful humans.
Yeah, see, that's why I said it sounded like God was gossiping or venting.
Yeah, but it feels more direct. Like, this part, yeah. I think that God is venting for sure. But also, like, in Order of the Phoenix and in Deathly Hallows after the Ministry takeover, the feel of this feels a lot like Harry's own, like, I have saved all of you in the magical world so many times. I did this, remember I did this, remember I did this, remember I did this. And what is the thanks I get for it? Nothing.
I did not die for this crap. As I believe we had him say in an earlier episode. Yeah.
Yep.
When we get to verse 7, one of the suggested sacrifices that God mentions is thousands of rivers of oil. And that sounds a little random to us. Yeah. In the ancient world, oil served a lot of very important purposes that when you're living in a analog, non-mechanical, very, primitive life, oil is something you deal with every day and does very important things for you. That would include cooking oil and lamp oil, both, sure. Mm-hmm. But living in a desert, there would also be oils for skin care and cleaning, both yourself and other things. Think of the massive amount of dust there is in a desert, and not to mention sand and getting that out of things. Oil actually works a lot better than water for that. And also oil is much more reusable than water in that when it comes to that kind of thing. And many, many other uses. So there's lots of different kinds of oil. This whole rivers of oil thing, you would sacrifice oil because oil was important and useful. Mm-hmm. Sacrifices were not... you didn't sacrifice things that were useless or pointless. So this isn't just random that God is mentioning. And of course, one of the many uses of oil back then would have been an ancient version of WD-40, because getting things to not have friction together, like, say, your wagon wheels and so on, would have been very important. But in the list of the many different kinds of oils that they would have had in the ancient world, we are not including essential oils, which have become something of a fad in recent years. They would have concentrated different kinds of oils and essences and so on for perfumes and medicinal purposes and things like that, just like we do, but they wouldn't have been able to get anywhere close to the concentration levels of essential oils. Mm. Although thinking about essential oils did make me want fanfic of Hermione passing legislation for, like, safety and medical purposes and so on through the Ministry of Magic on essential oils and keeping people on the accurate safety side of things and avoiding the the more pseudoscience aspects of the essential oil dialogue, like the people who keep trying to claim that it can cure cancer and so on, with safety measures and rules about children and pets and magical creature safety and stuff like that. And I love the idea of Hermione realizing that, this is one of those fads from the Muggle world that probably will cross over into the magical world, and let's just head this one off at the pass, shall we?
Yeah.
Our second reading for this Sunday is from 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 18 through 31. Paul compares what God has done to human ideas of wisdom and foolishness. While the cross looks foolish to the world, it is the center of wisdom for followers of Christ.
So one of the themes that I noticed in this passage was unanticipated realities. So Paul's talking about, right, foolishness and wisdom, and how unanticipated the wisdom is, that because God's wisdom appears as foolishness, people are like, what? This doesn't, what is going on?
Yeah.
And so I was thinking about how that fits in with the first book, when Hagrid's like, you're a wizard, Harry, and Harry's like, what? Huh?
Who is this strange giant man, and what drugs is he on? Yeah.
Yeah, and just that, like, bafflement at this reality that is completely out of his frame of reference, because the Dursleys have worked so hard to make it not a thing. Yeah, beautiful. The foolishness of the wisdom of Hagrid is foolishness to the Dursleys.
Yes. And many other people in the magical world, for that matter, throughout the books. When we reach verse 19, it sounds kind of like God is destroying the wisdom of Ravenclaw, right? Which wouldn't be a good thing.
Definitely
but on the other
not
hand,
a good thing.
Yeah. Ravenclaw comes in very handy many times. Wisdom is good, though, but it does also need the bravery of Gryffindor and the loyalty of Hufflepuff and the cunning of Slytherin to do the most good in the world. Wisdom alone is never enough. You need more to go along with it. And that is part of what this passage is saying. Wisdom is good, but there's more to the universe than that. And some of that looks like foolishness to people who don't have our faith.
Speaking of Ravenclaw wisdom, in the first part of verse 25, we hear again about God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom. And I was actually thinking about Luna and the way that she is deemed foolish by so many at Hogwarts and in the magical world, and yet there are things that she says and does that are so deeply and profoundly wise that like she really does in many ways embody God's wisdom being foolish to many.
Yeah. Verse 26 is one of my favorites. I love this bit about how not many of you were wise, not many of you were powerful, not many of you were born into noble houses. And that kind of reminds me of Dumbledore, who chose to place the entire future of the fight against Voldemort in the hands of a 1-year-old child. I mean, okay, yes, there's a prophecy involved, but he put a lot of weight on Harry's shoulders and probably could have done a little more to prep the world for Voldemort coming back. I'm just saying.
Yep.
And if you're going to say someone who was not born wise or powerful or born into a noble house, Harry had a lot of money, but aside from that, had no idea what was going on and that the magical world existed in the first place for a lot of his life. So I think that definitely applies to Harry.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and right after that, I thought about the way it says God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world. Things that are not reduced to nothing, things that are. And that one made me think of Neville. And, right, like, throughout the majority of the books, because Harry is the unreliable narrator, Neville is experienced as someone who is weak and low and despised and, right, like, not competent and all of these things. And the switch happens in Order of the Phoenix with Dumbledore's army and with, like, when Bellatrix escapes and he, like, Neville really buckles down and starts having breakthroughs, and so Neville goes from this weak despised, lowly first year to the one who leads Dumbledore's army in the 7th book.
Yeah.
Our gospel reading for this Sunday is Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Beginning the well-loved Sermon on the Mount, Jesus expounds on all those given blessings from God, even if they do not appear blessed to the rest of the world. Perhaps obvious theme for this passage is the unexpected rising up together. So the ways that Jesus is blessing those who are unexpected. They're not the ones the world thinks of as the blessed people. But then also thinking about like the Dumbledore's army and the ways that they were unexpected and yet did rise up in Deathly Hallows at Hogwarts. And I think sometimes I even fall into that pattern of not giving them credit for the importance of what they did, right? And being like, well, they were at Hogwarts, and like, what's going to happen at Hogwarts until Harry gets there? But it did matter a lot when they were at Hogwarts, and the ways that they were able to resist the Carrows and the impact of Voldemort on the school.
Yeah.
Then in verse 4, this one was like an easy connection for me, but Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." And so it's basically like, blessed is everyone after the Battle of Hogwarts, because everyone is mourning, because everyone has lost somebody. And even if they haven't lost a person in particular, there's a weightiness because so many people are in the Great Hall. And so like you just see the sheer numbers and ages of people who have been killed, and you can't help but mourn.
Yeah.
So in verse 5, we get, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." So I guess that just means that the earth and all of creation is going to the house elves.
Aw, I'd be okay with that.
Right, there are a lot worse things that could happen to the world.
They are very good stewards.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. When we reach verse 7, I was trying to think about all of these different things that are listed in this passage and who might be suited for them, and I really hit an unexpected snag with merciful, who in the Harry Potter books would we consider to be like primarily merciful or have that be a major characteristic for them. I know that Harry continually tries to get Voldemort to repent, which is merciful of him, but aside from that, mercy towards other people isn't really, I mean, it happens, but it's not a defining characteristic for any one person, I think. I mean, Hagrid will forgive an animal just about anything because they're an animal or a magical creature, and we love him for it, and that's great. But and he does kind of the same thing with students, but that was really the closest I could get to someone being like primarily merciful in the books.
Well, and I think there's another one from Harry that actually I think of as more, because I don't think...
Oh, when he doesn't kill Peter.
Mm-hmm. When he doesn't let anybody kill Peter. And
that's true.
It's like slightly complicated motivation, right? Because it's partly that...
I mean, anytime you're dealing with the person who killed your parents, I would hope it would be complicated.
You know. But, yeah. But partly it's that he doesn't want Sirius and Remus to become murderers because of Peter.
Which is merciful to them, too.
Yeah. But that whole part of Prisoner of Azkaban, I think, is really does embody what it means to be merciful.
And then in verse 12, it says that this verse has been taken a lot of very different and frankly weird ways over the years. And when it says that the prophets were persecuted in the same way, so you should be glad that you're being persecuted that way, this is not a you have something in common with famous people kind of moment. Isn't that awesome? Instead, it's a you are pissing off the powerful just like these people did, good for you kind of moment. Mm-hmm. If you get someone, say, like Umbridge, angry with you, just like Harry did, the good part isn't that you're getting persecuted or being made to serve painful detentions. It's that presumably you are working for justice and truth and compassion, just like Harry was. Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're not glorying in like physical punishment. That's not part of the Christian tradition. It's about the the reason why you made those people angry in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's time for a word from our sponsors, us.
Woohoo!
And today we're asking the question, how has fandom been our sponsor and helped shape who we are? My story for this is that fandom let me discuss lots of different kinds of things with lots of different kinds of people throughout fandom. Because fandom really draws from a diverse crowd in a lot of ways. And that led me to reading the experiences of people with, say, many different kinds of conditions that I had never heard of before. One of those being reading the experiences of people with ADHD, which was what eventually led to me getting my diagnosis of having ADHD. Actually, there's a specific Tumblr post I can point to. And that has had a profound effect on my life. And so I am grateful for the many experiences that fandom has allowed me to have over the years, but that one in particular has really changed how my life goes.
Yeah. I think I was thinking about this, and I think for me, my experience of just like reading fanfic and getting these like alternative ideas and stories about how the world came into being and what could be happening, right? I struggled when I was in college with like an assignment for a Bible class on like making our own gospel, because I was like, but I can't make up what Jesus did. That doesn't make sense. And I think fanfic has kind of helped me be more creative and ask more questions about what else is happening, both in the Bible and in stories, so that things like J.K. Rowling being a TERF don't hold as much weight as they might have when I first started reading the Harry Potter books. And so that I can wonder about different pieces of the Bible and why we're hearing some things and why we're not hearing others, and what the characters we're not hearing from might have thought. And that's, I mean, it's also part of like thinking about Tonks as being genderqueer or non-binary, or thinking about Remus and Sirius as being a couple, and the ways that then I get to read myself into stories would not have happened without fan fiction and fandom.
Awesome. Our final Sunday for this episode is the 5th Sunday after Epiphany, which this year will fall on the 9th of February. Our first reading for this Sunday is from Isaiah chapter 58, verses 1 through 9a, and possibly also including verses 9b through 12. God tells religiously unobservant Israel that if they want to earn God's favor, they should enact justice and help the poor, instead of observing fast days that cause division as repentance.
So, in this passage, God is kind of setting out some guidelines for community for the people of Israel, and so that they can be in relationship with each other and be community in ways that are life-giving. So then I was thinking about the ways that guidelines for the community are stated and the ways that people come up with them in the Harry Potter worlds. And I was having trouble because I think a lot of it is just so unwritten. And we experience that through Harry, where he's like, wait, what? There's a sorting? What does that mean? There's this? What? How does this work? But I think the DA comes up with some of it, right? They set out, this is who's going to be in it, this is who's going to do which thing, that sort of stuff. But I think probably the strongest is the room of requirement, and the ways that particularly Neville gets the room of requirement and is able to really dive into setting about the guidelines necessary to keep it as a safe place from the Carrows and from anyone who would seek to harm them.
Yeah. When we reach verse 1, we hear about announcing to the people their sins. And boy, I've got to say, that must be awfully effective coming from a prophet of God. Wow, there's a bad way to spend your afternoon. But can you imagine if the students of Hogwarts had all the house point gains and losses announced at, say, every mealtime with the names attached? Not only would that be probably a total ruiner of any conversation, which the professors might actually appreciate, come to think of it. But it would also clear up the rumors, but also, like, if it was just losing 1 or 2 points and nobody actually asked the question, you wouldn't be able to hide it. I'm just imagining, like, the professors taking turns doing these announcements and hearing Snape drone on, Weatherby lost Ravenclaw 2 points for behavior, but gained back 1 answering a question. Just imagine spending your meal times like that. Yikes.
There'd be so much shame caught up in all of that.
And so much unhealthy pride about the gains, too.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad they don't do that, although the rumors can get kind of ugly, too.
Yeah. And I think, like, there is a distinction between, like, communal accounting of sins and individual accounting of sins, right? Like,
yeah, I don't think what they're talking about in the Bible here is listing,
this
gaining and losing individual points with God.
Yeah.
I don't think we're getting that specific.
In verse 4, I was thinking about the ways God is accusing the people of fasting only to quarrel and to fight and to strike with a wicked fist. So fasting causes, like, the result of fasting being that people are, hangry.
That is definitely how I react to it, which is why I don't, generally.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so they fight and they argue and they get mad at each other a lot more easily. So, of course, I thought of Ron, because Ron has no ability to cope without really good meals consistently. And so that is what happens to Ron when they don't have access to really good food, where he gets really bitter and irritable and picks fights, and everybody kind of, like, has a tendency toward that, but Ron especially, because he's grown up with the privilege of having reliable meals his entire life.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a certain element of Ron is mentioned in the books to be tall, and that means he has a certain metabolism as well, and having grown up with that metabolism myself and gotten tall at around those ages, you need a lot more food to do all that growing than the littler people like, say, Harry and Hermione do. So.
So on brand for both of us.
Yes, exactly.
And continuing on this theme of fasting, after kind of pointing out the faults in the people's fasts, God then says, like, this is actually the fasting that I want. I want you to loose the bonds of injustice, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free and break every yoke. And so instead of, like, the showy actions of fasting where people notice that you're fasting and where you get the props for it, kind of like you were talking about with the recounting of the points lost and gained, okay?
Yeah.
It's just the steady, quiet commitment to a different way of being. And so then I was thinking about Mrs. Figg, because her work for the Order is almost completely unacknowledged. The only place it ever gets acknowledged is when she reveals that she's part of the Order because she comes to help at Harry's trial. But aside from that...
In Book 5.
Yeah, in Order of the Phoenix. But aside from that, she's, like, never really acknowledged. Because she's a squib, she can't go to all of the meetings because she can't travel as easily. All of that stuff, and it's just a, like, ridiculous.
Ridiculous.
Yes. It's a ridiculous lack of acknowledgement, but also, like, a really strong commitment from her.
Yeah.
Which is really cool.
I wonder if she wasn't a squib, if she would have been in Hufflepuff. It's a Hufflepuff-like thing to do.
It is.
When we get to verse 7, and it talks about specifically feeding the hungry, I know that the trio were busy when they were on the run in Book 7, but, I mean, even with all of the restrictions on it, the idea that you can magically increase the amount of food you have, even if you can't, like, preserve it magically, is kind of extraordinary to me. And I wonder if they had slightly changed their method of engagement with other people, both magical and muggle. What would have happened if they had intentionally sought out the hungry people, magical or muggle, and shared their food with them. I mean, that wouldn't really have taken them a lot more effort aside from not letting the muggles see them doing the spells. They would have been able to share a meal with anybody who happened to be around. And they could have helped a lot of people that way, and they might have changed how the public saw them if the public found out that everywhere that they went, they were constantly sharing food.
Perhaps, but I imagine the public finding out is part of the problem, right? That they're trying not to be found and not to encounter anyone for their own safety.
I know, but especially if they specifically were seeking out muggles, I guess, that wouldn't have been as much of an issue.
Yeah, but I mean, anybody could have done that, right?
Yeah,
that's part of when the Potter Watch encourages people to go to their neighbors' houses and cast protective spells around them. And
yeah, that's true. Well, or I suppose there is actually no reason why there couldn't be magical soup kitchens where the magical people are providing food not just for magical people but also for muggles by that logic.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Our second reading for this Sunday is 1 Corinthians 2 verses 1 through 12 and perhaps also verses 13 through 16. Paul reminds the Corinthians that he doesn't teach like the Greek philosophers do, proclaiming their own wisdom, but simply holds up Christ's death and resurrection for us to compare our lives to. So one of the themes that I picked up on in this passage was the different kinds of relationships that Paul is putting forward, a different way of being in relationship based on the way that God is in relationship with us and calls us the spiritual relationships. And so I was thinking about Hermione and Harry's relationship and the way that it is deep and profound, and not a sexual or romantic relationship. And I think, or Ginny and Neville have a deep connection, I think, also. And so this is part of...
Or even Harry and Ron.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is part of, I think, where the asexual communities are particularly gifted of there are so many different ways that we can be in relationship with each other.
Yes.
We're not restricted to this one way, which is the primary way that's depicted in all of the things, but we can have deep and profound relationships in other ways.
Yeah.
Cool. When we get into the passage, the first couple verses made me think about how Dumbledore approaches Harry. So Paul says, "When I came to you, siblings, I did not come proclaiming the mystery of God to you in lofty words or wisdom, for I decided to know nothing among you except Jesus Christ and Him crucified." And I was thinking about the way, one of the things that Dumbledore really does do well is that he invites Harry's wisdom and Harry's knowledge and Harry's perspective into conversations. So he doesn't just dictate and say this is the way things are because I have decided it and I know it to be so. But when Harry has concerns, even when Dumbledore has more information and all of that stuff, and he does stop Harry from pushing too far, but he invites Harry's wisdom and Harry's knowledge and suspicion.
You know who might have trained him in that? I hadn't thought of this before. But, when we see Dumbledore as a young man dealing with his brother and sister and so on, he kind of does do a lot of dictating, but then we see him later and he doesn't. And I think that his experience with his sister probably changed that somewhat. But you know who else he was constantly interacting with who wouldn't let him get away with that crap? Snape. Did Snape train him in that? I kind of wonder.
I don't know.
I think he probably had an effect.
Maybe.
Inviting other people's wisdom. Because Snape would insist on offering his own, so.
Yeah.
I wonder if that helped open Dumbledore up a bit.
Maybe. I'm suspicious of Snape being all that helpful for anything, except for spying. Maybe.
He didn't even have a collection of wigs and fake noses, after all.
It's true.
In verse 5, Paul says, so that your faith might not rest on human wisdom but on the power of God. And he says that because, of course, not everyone has wisdom, or even just a lot of wisdom. Just like not everyone has magic. In fact, far fewer people in this world have magic even than in the Harry Potter world. So our faith does not rest on magic. Or, for that matter, magic-like stories, like those stories that people have about how people couldn't find something and then they prayed and then they found it, or stuff like that. Miracles are a thing. They do happen, but they're not actually the basis of our faith. We don't base our faith on them because they're not predictable. I've heard a few people try to preach sermons on stories like that, like sermons that involve finding something you lost or getting a parking space or whatever. And it doesn't work for me because it immediately makes me think of all the people who prayed the exact same prayer and didn't find what they were looking for.
Mm-hmm.
So
sometimes it's actually just privilege or luck.
Yeah. And then in verse 6, Paul says, yet among the mature we do speak of wisdom. And of course I'm imagining that probably isn't including a lot of 11-year-olds.
Probably not. Although some.
Yeah. I mean, they have moments of wisdom here and there, but not exactly who I think of when I think of mature, as we learned in the Harry Potter books. So.
Definitely not.
Several times throughout the books, actually, because we keep experiencing 11-year-olds even as the trio gets older.
It's true. So who would the mature be in the Harry Potter world?
McGonagall, obviously.
Well, you didn't say it, so how obvious can it be?
Well, I don't think we can include Snape in that number.
Definitely not.
And a lot of other people are, dead or about to be dead. And so.
You can be wise and also about to be dead.
Well, yes. Or you can have been wise and also be dead.
Also true. I was thinking about for verse 15, verse 15 just feels really problematic to me because it's, so those who are spiritual discern all things, and they are themselves subject to no one else's scrutiny.
Oh my goodness.
But that's real problematic. That's how abuse happens a lot of the time in the church,
yes.
And abuse of power and other forms of abuse, because people decide, oh no, I'm above scrutiny, no one can say anything bad about me.
Yeah, you can see what Paul is pointing at, but that's been misused so badly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then I was also thinking about, that's part of the perspective that the magical community has about muggles, right? That the magical people can discern all the things, and they are not subject to any muggle scrutiny, when in reality, they would probably benefit a lot from muggle scrutiny, right? The ways that the other minister, the prime minister and the other minister interact, there's no respect for the wisdom of the prime minister.
No. Although, to be fair, if the muggles and magical people did both know about each other both ways, I have to say I think the muggles would treat the magical people like that too. I mean, isn't that part of why the International Statute of Secrecy came about? Because the muggles weren't... I mean, they were fearful of the magical people, but also they assumed that they knew better about how magic should be used, or...
That magical people knew better, or that muggles...
No, that the muggles assumed that they... I have a feeling that if the muggles did know about magical people, that there would be a certain amount of, let us put restrictions on how you can use your magic, not only to keep us safe, but also because we know better than you do, because we don't have it. Because we have this emotional space, I guess.
I mean, if they're Republicans... I don't actually think that would be the case, though. I think it could...
I don't know.
I think it would... My hope would be that it would be a conversation amongst a variety of people, magical and non-magical, and creatures.
I think that's a lovely hope.
And I think...
But the question is, do you think that's what would actually happen?
I think it could be, depending on who it is.
Yeah.
It's like with X-Men. You're doing the X-Men analogy, and there are a couple people who are in the X-Men universe that are yes, we have to dictate for all of them because we're scared and fearful. I think if you do it well...
I mean, there's an entire storyline, or like 8 of them actually, about sentinels and policing the mutant population and so on.
Mm-hmm.
If you're going into the comics instead of the movies, but
yeah, but I think it's a particular like fear-based response, and that's not the response we're called to.
No, I would agree with that.
Necessary response. I think
I'm Lutheran. I have been trained from an early age to see the possibilities of the worst in people. So
I'm Lutheran, and I've been trained from an early age to see the best possibilities in people.
Well, that's good too.
Yeah, I just think it's funny.
Yeah.
Together, we are a Lutheran. Sinner and saint.
Captain Planet! With our powers combined.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I balance in all things, etc. Moving on. Our gospel reading for this Sunday is from Matthew chapter 5, verses 13 through 20. Reminding the crowd at the Sermon on the Mount to be the light of the world, Jesus announces that he has come to fulfill and not abolish the law.
So a theme that comes up for this is fulfillment of purpose. Right? Jesus is talking about fulfilling the law, and the law as a guide for the community and as an invitation into community. And then I was thinking about the passage and wondering if McGonagall maybe was a Pharisee, because she also, I think, worked to fulfill the law and the prophets. So thinking about McGonagall as a Pharisee, she is deeply committed to the rules and the way that Hogwarts functions when it is functioning at its best, and is truly trying to do what is best for Hogwarts and for the whole community. And so in those ways, it really reminded me of like the Pharisees. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to figure out what is best and how best to care for the people entrusted to their care, particularly spiritual care, but their whole care. I think McGonagall is a Pharisee.
Okay, I could see that. This one, I will grant you, is a little bit of a jump, but just go with me here. Reading verse 13. Speaking about food and ingredients, like salt, we learn about a lot of magical ingredients for potions and other things in the Harry Potter world in the books. And, you know, there are actually some pretty creepy things hidden in the Harry Potter world if you go looking. Like, for example, the mandrakes. Do not, whatever you do, start imagining what taking live mandrakes and prepping them for being potion ingredients must be like.
Thanks.
Do not ask yourself whether it was Sprout or Pomfrey or both that does that.
Thanks for putting that into my head and imagination. I blame you.
You're welcome. I am here to ruin lives and childhoods.
Yep.
But speaking of salt losing its saltiness, like, there are times when the effectiveness of the Harry Potter world seems to be less so because I have just read those books so many times, although fanfic does help keep that alive for me. But there are also moments like this when I say to myself, "Yeah!" and suddenly they feel so much more real and effective than they have in a while because I follow a description to its natural conclusion, and it takes me somewhere scary. So.
That's fair. I went on a much more figurative route for verse 13, thinking about you are the salt of the earth, and thinking about who is salty in the magical world.
Keeping in mind that while I'm sure many of our listeners are young and hip to the ways of the world and what slang means, we may want to do a brief explanation. We're not talking about, like, actually being covered with salt or being like Lot's wife, but instead, well, if we're going to go with biblical images of salt, come on. Emily is quietly losing it, for those of you who can't see them. But when we say someone is being salty these days, it's kind of like being, on the one hand, sarcastically funny, but on the other hand, definitely kind of insulting about someone else or the world.
Anyway, so I was thinking about who's salty in Harry Potter. I did say it was figurative, at least.
Yes, you did.
And I was thinking about the Patil twins in Goblet of Fire at the Yule Ball. When
oh my goodness.
Like, treated terribly by Ron and Harry, and then finally are just like have had enough and peace out. But
yeah,
they are definitely salty. Yeah, but
come to think of it, Hermione has a few moments like that throughout the books, doesn't she?
Yeah. But I was trying to think about, like, it was hard to think of who's salty in the books, though.
Yeah, that's definitely not Snape's thing. I suppose in a slightly underhanded and not obvious way, Dumbledore is doing that when he meets the Dursleys, and is being forcibly polite and at the same time kind of insulting to them.
Yep. Yeah. And he's like, here, have a drink. Oh, what would be the polite thing to do is this. Oh, but usually when people start things with, I don't mean to be rude, what comes next is rude, so better just to not say anything at all. Yeah. He's super salty.
Yeah. And finally, in verse 14, we hear that a city built on a hill cannot be hid. But of course, as the Harry Potter world has taught us, a castle built on a hill can be hid if you have a few very talented wizards with lots of time on their hands.
Funny fact that both Kay and I had this may be the first time that we've ever like actually had the same response to the same verse.
Yeah, we talk about the same verses a lot, but we almost always have very different responses.
Yeah, but both of us went to the same place with this one.
Because corny puns are both a Harry Potter thing and Christian. And endorsed by HP at church.
Totally two of those three things. But I also was thinking about, so to take it one step farther, the D&D group that I'm in, that's Harry Potter based, one of the, early on in our adventure, one of the things that we did was that we got sent back in time to when the founders of Hogwarts were still alive, and they're like in the process of building the castle, and so it's like you can see the walls taking shape and stuff, and so much of their magical abilities are wrapped up in the building the castle in a magical way and stuff, that they like can't protect the castle necessarily in the future, but yeah, it's fun to see the castle taking shape as a castle on a hill and hidden. Although I don't remember if it's hidden yet. I don't think it's hidden yet. But it will be.
No, not for a couple more hundred years. I think the statute of secrecy went into effect in the 1600s sometime.
1692.
If I remember right. Yes. You know, that's interesting. Because when you said that you went back in time, my immediate thought would be I would be fascinated by what they were wearing back then, because historical fashion interests me. And historical magical fashion has got to be, like, really extraordinary. I mean, the stuff they wear these days is outlandish, but man, 1,000 years ago it must have been so much more. So,
although if they were in better relationship with Muggles, it wouldn't have been quite as... Like, part of why it's so outlandish now is because
they've been separated. But I was also thinking that several hundred years ago, the fabric that they made to make their clothes out of was such better quality, like especially linen in particular, but several other kinds too. Stuff that we cannot even begin to replicate it these days. Like, even if we were going to try to use the exact same methods they did, they had lifetimes of experience and knowledge behind them that we have since lost in terms of how to do it by hand, and we definitely can't replicate it with machines. But I wonder, in the Harry Potter world, if part of the reason why our quality of fabric has gone down is because of the statute of secrecy. And we no longer have access as Muggles to the magical ways of making fabric.
Yeah, that makes sense. Probably.
Because that means that the magical city built on a hill has been hidden. And that is what is keeping us from that high quality fabric.
Whoa, that's deep. Very deep. Well, thanks for joining us. Catch us next time when we discuss Harry Potter connections to the scripture readings for more of the time after Epiphany.
This podcast has been produced by us, Kay Roloff and Emily Ewing. For more fun, check us out on Twitter, Facebook, and WordPress, all at HPATCHURCH. Or contact us at hpatchurch@gmail.com. This season, we're also putting our episodes on YouTube, where you can listen and see subtitles. So make sure you let your friends know and search for us.
Also, if you like what you've heard, rate us or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Facebook, or wherever you catch your podcasts. As the ancient Christian said,
Pax vobiscum.